Welcome to the deep dive, where we take these fascinating source materials and we kind of boil them down, get those key insights, those like really important takeaways. So think of it as, your shortcut to being truly well-informed, like really getting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, today we're diving deep into grit. And based on the excerpts, we're really kind of looking at what it means, that powerful combination of passion and, that sticking to itness, I guess, for those big long-term goals.
Exactly. And, knowing that you're someone who, values getting that knowledge quickly but thoroughly, right? You love those aha moments but without feeling overwhelmed. This deep dive is like tailored for you. We want to cut through the surface level stuff and really get to the heart of this powerful, driver of success. We see it in these psychology and achievement sources. Our mission today, pretty simple. Understand what grit is, why it often beats talent alone, and figure out if and how we can actually develop more of it ourselves. So, okay, let's unpack this thing, starting with something that really jumped out at me, this whole challenge to our usual focus on talent.
Yeah, that's huge. That initial emphasis on de-emphasizing innate ability, it's so key. The author starts off, right, with this really relatable story about her father and his real concern with, his kids' intelligence, comparing them unfavorably to Einstein, which, sets the stage perfectly for that later irony of her getting a MacArthur Genius Grant. The core insight here, though, traditional measures of intelligence, they just aren't the only or even the primary, determinants of big achievement.
Right. It really makes you think, doesn't it? We so often equate success with being just naturally gifted. But then you look at the West Point studies, right? For years, they couldn't figure out who would drop out of that crazy intense beast barracks training. They had all this data, SATs, ACTs, high school rank, leadership, physical fitness, the whole shebang. They called it their whole candidate score. And yet, none of it reliably predicted who would quit.
It's so true, isn't it? I mean, they had this seemingly complete picture of these young men and women, but they were missing something, that crucial piece of the puzzle. And what's fascinating, is what this military psychologist, Mike Matthews, discovered. It wasn't talent, not in the traditional sense anyway. It was this, never give up attitude that was the deciding factor.
Wow, that's a real aha moment. So it wasn't about being the smartest or the strongest right out of the gate. And get this, it wasn't just in this super extreme military environment, right? The author, she talked to leaders in all sorts of fields. Business, arts, sports, journalism, you name it. And the consistent message was, you got to have that hang in there posture. You got to push through when things get tough.
Exactly, yeah. And that leads to, I think, a kind of surprising but really important realization. Talent. It's no guarantee of grit. I mean, you can be super gifted at something, incredibly talented, but still lack that passion and that perseverance to really excel in the long haul. You know what I mean?
That brings us to this really powerful idea. Effort counts twice. We tend to be so fixated on talent when we're explaining success, almost like it's the magic ingredient.
Right.
And this focus can totally overshadow other super important factors, grit being a major one. It's like our default explanation is, oh, they're successful because they're just so talented. End of story.
Yeah, and, it can be so dismissive of the work,
Yeah.
The sheer hard work, the dedication that often underlies these big achievements. And I think the story of Scott Barry Kaufman really illustrates this point perfectly. He was initially placed in special education. And, that's a label that often suggests a lack of, natural intellectual talent, right?
Yeah.
Yet this guy went on to earn degrees from these top universities and became this well-respected academic psychologist. And the key takeaway here, those perceived limitations early on, they don't define your future potential if you have grit, if you have that drive.
I mean, think about Scott's story, right? He actively sought out challenges. He learned Latin. He joined the school musical and the choir. He relentlessly pursued his passion for cello. This wasn't just about enjoying those activities. It was fueled by a real desire to prove his intellectual capabilities. It was like, hey, don't underestimate me.
Right. And that supports the effort counts twice argument so well. The author's basically saying effort isn't just as important as talent. It's at least twice as important. Think of it this way. Talent might give you that head start, but it's consistent effort. That's what refines that talent. That's what ultimately leads to mastery.
And to really, drive this point home, the excerpts talk about George Vaillant's research. He used the Harvard treadmill test. This was way back in 1940. And these young men, they were assessed not just on their physical capacity, but also on their willingness to push themselves, on a treadmill, literally. Their tendency to give up when it got hard. And decades later, get this, Vaillant followed up with these guys, now in their 60s, and the findings were wild. Their push on that early treadmill test actually correlated with their psychological well-being and life success in adulthood, like impacting things like income, career advancement, health, and relationships. Crazy, right?
I mean, it's mind-blowing. That initial willingness to exert effort in this challenging situation, it had these huge long-term effects, across their entire lives. It really underscores the idea that effort, it's not just about like tackling the immediate task, it's building something within you that has these lasting benefits.
And all this brings us to the author's, definition of grit. Working on something you care about so much that you're willing to stay loyal to it. It's not just about, the initial spark of doing what you love. It's about staying in love with it. It's about that commitment through all the ups and downs.
Okay, so we're getting a sense of what grit is, why it matters so much. But how do you measure something like that? I mean, is there a gritometer?
Well, sort of. The author developed this thing called the grit scale. It's mentioned in the excerpts. It's basically a questionnaire, right? Used in studies like the ones at West Point and with the Chicago public school students. You rate yourself on statements related to perseverance and like the consistency of your interests.
And it's interesting, right? The grit isn't just this like one-dimensional thing. It's got these two key components. Passion, that's your consistency of interest over time. And then perseverance, that tendency to not give up when you hit those roadblocks.
Right.
And you can actually calculate separate scores for each of those. What's encouraging, though, is that grit isn't fixed. It's not like you're born with it or you're not.
Yeah.
It can actually change and grow over time.
Okay, so that brings us to the million-dollar question. How do we actually grow grit? How do we get more of it? The excerpts highlight these 4 key psychological assets that can help us build grit, like from the inside out. Let's start with, interest. It seems like a good place to begin.
Right, right. And when we talk about interest, the author actually challenges that whole follow your passion advice. I mean, we hear it all the time, right? In those commencement speeches and all that. But the reality is how passion actually develops, it's a lot more complex.
For sure. I mean, even the author's father's career is a perfect example of this. He initially went into a practical field, at DuPont after the family business hit some hard times. But over his 35 years there, guess what? His work became his passion. So it makes you wonder, should we be searching for this pre-existing passion, or can it actually develop by, engaging with something, becoming really skilled at it?
I think that's such a good point, the core insight here. Passions usually aren't these like sudden lightning bolt revelations, right? They develop over time. It's about engaging with something that captures your attention, your imagination, and then, refining that interest over time.
Right. Right. And it's not just about the initial excitement. Benjamin Bloom, he did this really interesting research on these high achievers
Right.
across different fields. And he found, get this, 3 stages of skill development. In the early stages, it's all about, discovering and nurturing those interests. Think fun, encouragement, little wins, and really important limited early criticism. It's about exploring and finding what really resonates with you.
Exactly. And we see this in the examples they give. Will Shortz, the New York Times crossword puzzle editor, I mean, he was just immersed in puzzles and language, from when he was little, thanks to his mom. And then Jeff Bezos, his early curiosity, about how things worked, that was totally fostered by his environment, right?
Yeah.
So these early experiences, they provided these opportunities, these seeds to spark and cultivate those interests.
Okay, but how do you maintain that interest, in the long run, especially as you become more proficient? I mean, doesn't it get boring?
Well, the author argues, that for experts, that novelty, it comes from a deeper understanding. It's about exploring all the nuances within their field. It's that idea of the more I know, the less I understand. There's always more to learn, more to discover, which keeps it interesting.
Okay, so that's interesting. So then we come to the second psychological asset, right? Practice. But not just any practice. This is about deliberate practice, pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone, setting those challenging stretch goals, seeking feedback, to really get better.
Right. The key is intentionality. Deliberate practice is about going beyond your current level and having those specific goals and that critical feedback loop.
It's so true. It's not just about putting in the hours, right? You could spend a lot of time doing something and not really improve if you're not focused and intentional. Deliberate practice means really specific goals, concentrating your effort, actively looking for feedback on how you're doing, and then repeating that process to, make those improvements really stick.
Yeah. And habits are huge here, right? Habits. They're crucial for making practice more consistent. By developing good routines around your practice, you make it more automatic. It's not so reliant on willpower, in the moment. It's just part of what you do.
Okay, so habits are huge. I get it. And the excerpts also, mention this difference between deliberate practice and flow. That feeling when you're totally in the zone, you're completely absorbed in what you're doing, it feels effortless. Deliberate practice, because it involves pushing your limits, it often feels, more effortful, while flow just feels almost automatic.
Right. But the author points out that deliberate practice can be really rewarding in its own way. That
Mhm.
feeling of like, wow, I'm getting better, that satisfaction of seeing your own progress.
Right, exactly. And they also emphasize, how important great coaches or mentors or teachers are for maximizing the benefits of deliberate practice. They can give you that crucial feedback, help you set those effective stretch goals, and guide you along the way. They're like, your secret weapon, for sure. Okay, so we've got interest, practice, and now we come to the third asset, purpose. This idea that having a sense of purpose, something bigger than yourself, can be a really powerful motivator, to keep going.
Yeah, and the excerpts talk about this distinction, right, between hedonic happiness, which is about pleasure, and, eudaimonic happiness. And that's happiness that comes from meaning and purpose. And research suggests that grittier people, they're more driven by that eudaimonic happiness. They want their life to mean something.
And this analogy of the three bricklayers, I love this. You've got one who sees it as just a job, right? Another sees it as a career stepping stone, climbing the ladder.
Yeah.
And the third sees it as a calling, as building something significant, something that matters. And those are the people who really exhibit that grit.
Yeah, and the point here is that a calling isn't usually something you just stumble upon. It's something you build, you cultivate. It's about taking what you do, and seeing how it connects to others, to the bigger picture, to your values.
Right, right. And the examples, they're so inspiring, right? Michael Kearney, he found purpose in creating this meditation class for people with serious health conditions. And it all came from his own personal experience. Then there's Bill Damon. He studies how young people develop lives that are both personally fulfilling and contribute to the community. They give back. And then there's Kat Cole. She built this crazy successful bakery chain. She was driven by this desire to help others, even from way back when she was working in the food service industry.
And finally, the fourth psychological asset.
Hmm.
We come to hope. And this is really linked to that growth mindset and, being able to bounce back when you face setbacks.
Yeah, and the excerpts talk about Marty Seligman's work, learned helplessness versus learned optimism. And that key difference is in how we interpret these negative events. Optimists see setbacks as temporary, just a bump in the road. Pessimists, they see them as permanent and pervasive, like it's the end of the world. And no surprise, optimists tend to perform better even after they experience failure.
Exactly. And Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset is so important here. It's about believing that your abilities can be developed, with dedication and hard work, as opposed to that fixed mindset where you think your talent's just, set in stone. With a growth mindset, failure isn't evidence of your limitations. It's just an opportunity to learn and get better.
And this mindset stuff, it's not fixed either. I mean, this adolescent rat experiment by Steve Mayer, it's fascinating. It suggests that experiencing controllable stress during adolescence can actually build resilience. Like, it can protect you against learned helplessness later in life. So facing challenges and learning how to overcome them, it's like building up those mental muscles.
Right. So practically speaking, cultivating hope means like practicing optimistic self-talk and engaging in resilience training. Learning to reframe those negative experiences in a positive and, constructive light.
Okay, so these four psychological assets, interest, practice, purpose, and hope, they really focus on how we can build grit from within. But, the excerpts also explore how the people around us can, play a huge role, too. Let's talk about that.
For sure. Parenting, it's a critical factor. The author challenges this idea of, strict, tough love balance. They suggest that supportive parenting and demanding parenting aren't mutually exclusive. It's
Yeah.
not either or. What's most effective is this wise parenting or authoritative parenting. High expectations, but also love, respect, and understanding. That combo seems to be the sweet spot.
Right, and role modeling is so powerful. I mean, kids are always watching us, imitating us. So when we show grit in our own lives, it sets a powerful example. And the excerpts, they talk about creating environments where these grit-related behaviors are actively practiced, encouraging consistent engagement in things like ballet, for example, which, it teaches kids about interest development, practice, purpose, even hope. And then there's the hard thing rule that the author uses in her own family. It's this idea that everyone in the family takes on a challenging activity that requires deliberate practice.
Yeah.
So cool, right? It's like building that grit muscle together.
Yeah, absolutely. And beyond the family, right? There's also the power of, teams and culture. That idea of to become a great swimmer, join a great team. A gritty culture can really shape individuals, reinforcing and amplifying those traits. Like the Finnish concept of sisu, it's this deep-seated perseverance, even when things get really tough. It shows how cultural values can actually, shape our capacity for grit. And then you've got Pete Carroll with the Seattle Seahawks. His efforts to build that culture of grit, it shows how this can be done intentionally. Even in professional sports organization.
And, even if someone didn't have that, ideal early family environment, the excerpts, they remind us that mentors and supportive relationships can make such a huge difference. The story of Cody Coleman, he found crucial support from his brother and a wise math teacher. So grit can be fostered in all sorts of ways. It doesn't have to come just from your parents, thankfully.
And then there's this follow-through factor. So fascinating. Warren Willingham's Personal Qualities Project, they call it the Grit Grid, right? And it showed this really strong link between, being consistently involved in extracurricular activities, throughout high school. And it correlated with later success, in college and beyond. It wasn't just about, being a part of things. It was that commitment over time, that follow-through.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot. What grit is, why it's so important, how it develops, both from the inside out and through all these external influences. As we wrap up, are there any final thoughts or, broader implications we should touch on?
Well, the author does mention, briefly that there might be limits, maybe some potential downsides to extreme levels of grit, maybe leading to a lack of flexibility or something. But overall, the message is pretty clear. In our society today, the issue isn't too much grit. It's probably not enough.
Right. It's about finding that, that sweet spot, that healthy dose of passion and perseverance that helps us achieve those meaningful, long-term goals that we set for ourselves.
So to quickly sum up our deep dive, right? Grit. That powerful combo of passion and perseverance. And it's often way more important than just innate talent. We talked about those 4 key psychological assets, those inner strengths, interest, practice, purpose, and hope. And we looked at the role of external influences, like supportive parenting, being part of a gritty culture.
And as always, we want to leave you with a final thought to, really chew on. Considering all these insights into grit, what is one hard thing you might commit to pursuing? And how could you intentionally nurture those 4 psychological assets, that interest, practice, purpose, and hope in that endeavor? Or think about this. As you reflect on the role models in your life, how did their actions, their beliefs, contribute to your own capacity for grit?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope these insights give you some, valuable food for thought as you continue on your journey of, growth and achievement.